The Cimarron River crested 9 feet above its ordinary channel on the morning of October 11th, 1899, and by noon it had taken the land office with it. Not the building itself, not entirely. The walls stayed. It was the records that went. The deed boxes stacked on the low shelf the way they had always been stacked, the way anyone sensible would have stacked them, the way the previous recorder had stacked them for 11 years without incident. 3 pine boxes, each fitted with a brass hasp, each holding the document ownership of roughly a third of Colfax County's private land. The water reached the shelf in the first hour. By the second hour, the boxes were floating. By the time Aldous Crane rode out to survey the damage on the afternoon of October 12th, there was nothing on that shelf but a line of silt and a scatter of paper scraps too swollen to read. Crane stood in the doorway of the land office for a long time, his hat in his hand, water still dripping from his coat, looking at what remained of approximately 340 documents. Then he turned his horse north and rode toward the county record office on Cimarron Avenue, toward a woman he had spent the better part of 4 months dismissing, toward a room full of ledgers he had called, in public and without apology, a waste of good oak. Before we reach that doorway and what Crane found when he opened it, it is worth going back to the spring that made it possible. Theron Frostbourne arrived in Cimarron on the 3rd of April, 1899, carrying 2 canvas bags and a leather satchel that held her father's surveying field books. She was 31 years old. The territorial government had appointed her county recorder for Colfax County 3 weeks earlier, an appointment that came through the office of the territorial secretary with a single paragraph of instruction and no ceremony. She had traveled south from Rayton on the morning stage, and she reached Cimarron in the early afternoon to find the main avenue still deep in spring mud, the cottonwoods just showing their first pale green along the creek, and a sky the specific hard blue of the high desert after a wet March. The mule, Cato, followed on a lead line behind the stage. He had been her father's animal, and then her own for 6 years, and he walked with the patient, level gait of something that had covered a great deal of ground and expected to cover a great deal more. She tied him to the post in front of the record office and stood for a moment with her satchel in hand, reading the building before she entered it. The record office was a single-story adobe building on Cimarron Avenue, 2 rooms with a plank floor that had swollen and cracked through a wet winter. The air inside smelled of cold ash and the particular sour damp of paper that had not been disturbed in weeks, and the light that came through the 2 small windows on the south wall was pale and flat, and moved with the dust it raised. The previous recorder, a man named Hartley who had held the post for 11 years and left it for a land claim in Arizona, had organized the county's documents in 3 pine deed boxes on a low shelf along the east wall. The boxes were functional and familiar. Nearly every county office in the territory kept its records the same way. No one had ever questioned the shelf. Theron set her bags down on the desk. She opened the satchel and took out her father's field books, 7 of them, cloth-covered and stitched at the spine, each one filled with her father's cramped survey notations and, inside the back cover of each, a hand-drawn cross-index that mapped every entry to every related parcel and every related owner. The spines were dark where his hands had held them, worn smooth at the corners. She stood the field books on the desk in a row and looked at them for a moment. Then she looked at the 3 pine deed boxes on the low shelf. She looked at the plank floor beneath the shelf, which sat, she estimated, about 8 inches above ground level. She looked at the east wall where the plaster showed a faint brown water line at roughly knee height. She ran one finger along the line, light enough not to disturb the plaster, and felt the slight roughness where the silt had dried into the wall years before. She said nothing to anyone about what she had noticed. She went to the hardware store on the south end of the avenue that same afternoon and priced oak boards. The proprietor, a quiet man named Henley, told her the boards were 50 cents per running foot. He watched her make note of it with the attentive patience of a man who has learned to take orders from whoever brings them. She thanked him and spent the next hour sketching dimensions on the back of a postal envelope. By the end of April, she had ordered the materials. She spent $17.40, which she paid from her first month's recorder salary of $22. The purchase covered 6 lengths of 3-inch oak, a quantity of cut nails, and 4 yards of oilskin cloth that she ordered from a dry goods supplier in Rayton. Cato stood in the alley beside the record office and watched the boards come off the wagon with the placid expression of an animal that has seen a great many deliveries and considers none of them remarkable. What she was building, though she used no special term for it, was a set of raised oak cabinets fitted with oilskin liners, designed to hold her ledger volumes at a height of 32 inches from the floor, which was to say roughly 18 inches above the waterline she had read from the stain on the east wall. The cabinets were mortised at the corners rather than nailed, which made them heavy and required twice the work. The mortising took most of 2 weeks, evenings and early mornings, the mallets knocked carrying into the alley where Cato stood in the spring dust and regarded the sound without alarm. The oak smelled resinous where she cut the joints, and the shavings came up pale and curled at her feet on the plank floor. The oilskin liners were fitted inside each cabinet's lower half so that any water that entered from below would be met with a sealed barrier before it reached the paper. The ledger volumes themselves, 14 in total, would be organized not by date of filing, but by parcel, with a cross-index keyed to grantor, grantee, and legal description, so that any single deed could be located by 3 separate paths rather than one. Her father, Harmon Frostborn, had been a licensed land surveyor for 22 years before his death in 1896. He had taught Theron to read field notes before she was 12, and to draw the cross-index before she was 15. He had told her once, sitting at the kitchen table in their house in Rotten with his field books spread between them, that a survey note you could not find in the field was a survey note that did not exist. She had been 17 that evening. He had said it quietly, smoothing the cover of the nearest field book flat with his palm as he spoke, the way a man says a thing he has long since stopped thinking of as opinion and has come to think of as ground. Theron had written that down in the margin of her own notebook that evening, not as a lesson but as a fact, the way you write down what a plumb line reads. Aldous Crane came to the record office on the 2nd of June. He arrived mid-morning with his plat case under one arm, and he introduced himself with the careful formality of a man who considers introductions to be professional documents. Crane held the county surveyor's appointment and had held it for 7 years. He was a careful, knowledgeable man of 52, with a surveyor's habit of measuring everything he looked at before he spoke about it. He had heard that the new recorder was installing some kind of cabinet system, and had come, he said, as a professional courtesy, to see whether the ledger format would align with his plat books. He looked at the cabinets for a long time. He set his plat case on the corner of the desk and put both hands flat on the top of the nearest cabinet. Pressing down once, testing its solidity, he looked at the height of the lower shelf and then at the floor, and then at the oilskin liner that Theron was trimming with a small knife. He asked what she was expecting those liners to do. She said, "Keep the paper dry." He said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the index she had drawn on a loose sheet pinned above the cabinet, a grid of parcel numbers keyed to ledger volume and page. He said, "That's a significant departure from standard county filing practice." She said yes. He told her, still politely, that the current system had served Colfax County for 11 years, and that a more elaborate method was not necessarily a more sound one. He said the cross index in particular would require a specialized knowledge that no future recorder was guaranteed to have, and that a system dependent on a single person's understanding was a system waiting to fail. He said this with the measured authority of a man who had spent 7 years explaining land measurements to people who had not asked for the explanation, and was nonetheless correct. Theron listened to him finish. She said, "Every deed in this county should be findable 3 ways from any one of those 3 ways. That is what the cross index does. Whoever comes after me will have the index to read from." Crane left without further comment. He was not satisfied, but he was not yet certain he was right. The summer moved forward. Theron completed the cabinets in late June, working evenings after the office closed, occasionally with Miriam sitting in the doorway, reading aloud from a newspaper, while Theron fitted the last pieces of oilskin and tested the cabinet latches. Miriam was 24, practical and warm in equal measure, and she had followed her sister to Cimarron because there was no sensible reason not to. She helped without being asked and questioned without malice, which was the family way. She asked Theron in July, sitting on the edge of the plank floor with a cup of coffee cooling beside her, whether all of this was strictly necessary. The deed boxes had held Colfax County's records for 11 years, she pointed out. No one had complained. No deed had gone missing. Theron set down her pen. She looked at the cabinet in front of her, its oilskin liner pale and smooth in the lamplight. She said, "Paper that cannot be found is paper that does not exist." Miriam thought about that, she said. "And paper that gets wet?" Theron said, "Same thing." The community's opinion formed itself without much ceremony across July and August. It was delivered mostly at the mill yard on the north edge of town, where Wallace Drum held a kind of informal court on Saturday mornings, while his crew loaded timber onto the Santa Fe wagons. The yard smelled of pine resin and raw sawdust, and the sounds of the work carried into the street. The scrape of hewn timber against the wagon bed, the thud of logs set down by men who had been setting down logs for years. Drum was 48 years old, heavyset, and possessed of a voice that carried across open ground without apparent effort. He had milled lumber for Colfax County for 20 years and had an opinion about most things that touched the county's commerce or governance. He had heard about the cabinets from Henley at the hardware store, and from one of the stage drivers who had helped carry the oak boards, and from his own wife, who had occasion to visit the record office in June to file a deed transfer for a parcel her family held on the mesa. His wife had come home and described the office to him in some detail, including the index sheet on the wall and the oilskin liners and the 14 ledger volumes arranged in a specific order she had not fully understood. Drum had listened to all of it and said when she finished, "Sounds like Frostborn's fancy." The names spread the way such names do, not by announcement but by repetition. Each used a small confirmation that the thing had been correctly named. By August, Drum was using it openly at the mill yard on Saturday mornings, and 2 of the stage drivers had picked it up, and a man named Gifford, who kept the dry goods account at the bank, had used it once in the bank itself without lowering his voice. Frostborn's fancy. The phrase carried a clear enough meaning, which was that an elaborate and unnecessary system had been imposed on a county office by a woman who did not understand that the purpose of a record office was to hold documents, not to catalog them as if they were the contents of a university library. In late August, Crane was present at the mill yard on a Saturday morning, waiting on a load of hewn posts for a survey crew. He heard Drum use the phrase for what was probably the 20th time, in a comment directed at the new territorial land examiner who had come through Cimarron for a routine inspection. Crane said, "It is irregular," which was not precisely agreement, but was close enough to function as one in that company. He said it without turning from the stack of posts he had been counting, which meant he spoke to the air in front of him as much as to the men behind him. And for Crane, that was its own kind of precision. He meant the cross index. He meant the mortised oak construction and the oilskin and the height of the shelving, all of it departing from what a county record office was expected to do and expected to look like. He had visited the office twice more since June, once to check a plat reference, and once simply to look at the index again. And he had not found an error in it. He had not found an error. But he had also not found a reason to say so at the mill yard on a Saturday morning. Theron knew what they were saying. Cimarron was a small enough town that nothing circulated long without reaching the person it concerned. Miriam told her one evening in September that a woman at the quilting circle had used the phrase within earshot, and had done so with the particular cheerfulness of someone who thought they were sharing something harmless. Miriam said she had said nothing in response, but her voice carried a particular edge that told Theron she had wanted to. She was standing at the washstand when she said it, wringing out a cloth with more force than was strictly needed. Theron said, "Let them name it what they like." She was sitting at her desk with the 14th ledger volume open in front of her, checking an entry against the cross index. She did not look up. The lamp on the desk put a small circle of gold on the page and left the rest of the room in the gathered dark of a September evening. She went back to her work. The month of September passed quietly in the record office. Theron completed the final entries in the 14th ledger volume and ran the cross-index checks twice. She reorganized 4 deed transfers that the previous recorder had filed under grantor only, assigning each one the additional parcel and grantee references and noting the correction on the index sheet in ink of a slightly different weight, so a future reader would know where the original filing had been and why the additional entries existed. She was particular about such things. She had learned from her father's field books that the margin note was as important as the main entry, because the margin note explained the thought behind it, and the thought was what held the record together when the facts alone were ambiguous. The weather turned in late September. The rains that came in the final week of the month were heavier than usual, and they came from the south, which was not the ordinary direction. They fell in long gray curtains that dissolved the maze's outline and turned the unpaved sections of Cimarron Avenue to standing clay. The Cimarron ran dark and fast through the canyon above town, carrying a load of red silt that stained the shallows orange where the current spread. 2 ranchers who grazed land along the river bottom moved their cattle to higher pasture in the last days of September, not in response to any official warning, but because they were people who watched the water and had seen it rise in certain ways before. A cottonwood came down across the upper ford on the morning of October 3rd, which was the kind of sign that means something to a person paying attention. Theron saw the cottonwood on the morning of October 4th, when she rode Caddo north on an errand to check a section marker. She noted the color of the water and its speed. She thought about the brown water line on the east wall of the record office and about the height of her cabinets from the floor. And then she went home and looked at both numbers again in her head, the way you check a column of figures when you already know the sum but want to be sure. The night of October 10th, she worked late. She did not call it preparation, at least not aloud. She checked that each of the 14 ledger volumes was closed and latched within its cabinet. She checked the oilskin liner seams on all 4 cabinets, pressing her fingers along the lower edges where the cloth met the wood. The rain on the roof came down steady and close, drumming against the tar paper with a persistence that made the office feel smaller than it was. She moved the single loose deed box that had been sitting on the floor beside the desk, a holdover from Hartley's time that she had never fully sorted, and placed it on the desk surface out of reach of any water that might come in under the door. She set her father's field books beside it, all 7 of them, on top of the desk rather than on the shelf where she usually kept them. When she had finished, she stood for a moment in front of the 4 closed cabinets, the lamplight lying warm across the oak grain and the pale seams of the oilskin liners. And then she put on her coat and went out. Miriam was asleep when Theron came home. Cato was in the small stable behind the house, and the stable roof was low and tight, and Theron stood in the stable doorway for a moment listening to the rain before she went inside. Cato turned his head toward her in the dark, his ears swiveling forward, and she laid one hand briefly on the warm curve of his neck. He did not shift or pull. He was settled and dry, and did not require anything from her, which was enough. The river crested at 9 feet above its ordinary channel on the morning of October 11th. The water moved through the low part of Cimarron Avenue in the early morning hours, carrying loose timber and brush and the various light objects that a flooded street will collect. The land office on the south end of the avenue was in the path of the heaviest flow. The water entered through the west wall's lower gap, a space where the adobe had settled slightly over the years, and it rose inside the building with a calm and indifferent persistence. By 6 in the morning, the 3 deed boxes on the low shelf were standing in 4 inches of water. By 7, they were floating. The boxes, being pine, did not sink. They drifted toward the east wall, where they fetched up against each other and rocked with the slow movement of the water. The brass hasps kept 2 of them closed. The third had a hasp that had always been loose, and it opened in the water, and the contents, approximately 113 loose deeds and transfer documents, dispersed into the flood. The other 2 boxes eventually took on enough water through their plank seams to sink to the floor, where the documents inside absorbed the river for the better part of 4 hours before the water began to recede. Approximately 340 documents in total were either lost or rendered illegible. Every deed recorded under the previous recorder's system for the years 1892 through 1898 was among them, along with a quantity of plat notes and survey certifications that Crane had filed with the land office and considered his most complete set of secondary records. The county record office on the upper part of Cimarron Avenue took on water under the door, a shallow sheet that spread across the plank floor and reached a depth of roughly 3 inches before it stopped. The east wall showed a fresh water line at 26 inches from the floor, a dark horizontal band the color of wet clay, the silt still faintly damp where a finger ran across it. The cabinets stood at 32 inches. Theron arrived at the record office at 7:30 in the morning. Cato tied outside to the post on the dry side of the building. The morning air smelled of river mud and bruised cottonwood bark, the cold sweetness that comes with water receding from ground. It is claimed. She pulled the door open and stood in the frame. The plank floor was dark and slick, the boards swollen along their edges, and a thin pale crust of silt had dried along the baseboard on the east wall. The desk surface held a faint water ring near its far corner where something had floated and settled and been carried back with the retreating flood. Her father's field books sat in their column exactly where she had stacked them the night before. Cloth covers dry, spines unwarped. She looked at the cabinets, each one standing on its mortised legs with the latch handles still turned to closed and the oilskin liners intact along the lower edges. She looked at all of it with the expression of someone who has checked a column of figures twice and found the same answer both times. She opened the nearest cabinet. The ledger volumes inside were dry. She drew out the volume labeled 1897 to 1898 and held it in both hands, feeling the cloth cover, the solid weight of it, the binding cloth faintly textured under her thumbs. She opened it. The ink was clear. She replaced it and opened the second cabinet, and the third, and the fourth. 14 volumes. Every one of them dry, every cross-index intact. every deed entry legible and in place. She latched the cabinets closed again, pressing each latch until she felt its seat. She went out to the alley and brought Cato inside, out of the rain that was still coming down in a steady gray sheet. And she stood beside him in the record office and waited. Cato settled into his standing stillness, his large head lowered to a resting angle, his breath warm and slow in the cold air of the room. If you have been following this story, now might be a good moment to subscribe, because what happens at that door in the next 2 days is the part that Colfax County did not forget. Come back with us. Aldous Crane arrived the following morning, October the 12th. He had spent the 11th surveying the damage on the south end of the avenue, confirming the loss of his plat notes, writing down what he had seen in the land office in his field book with the precise and somber economy of a man who catalogs what he cannot change. He had written the number 340 in the margin, drawn a line beneath it, and written approximate beside it, and closed the book. He rode north to Cimarron Avenue in the mid-morning, his coat still damp from the previous day. The collar turned up against a wind that had come in from the north with the receding rain and still smelled of the river's aftermath. He dismounted at the record office and tied his horse beside Cato, who regarded him with mild interest and then returned to his patient inspection of the middle distance. He did not knock. The door was open. He stepped inside and stopped. The floor was still muddy at the edges where the water had retreated and left its silt, a pale gray crust beginning to dry and crack along the baseboards. The water line on the east wall was plain. Crane looked at all of it without speaking, the way a man looks at something he is trying to make consistent with what he already knows. He looked at the floor, then at the water line, then at the 4 oak cabinets standing above the water line with their latches closed. He took his field book from his coat pocket and opened it to the margin number, looked at it, looked at the cabinet height, and closed the book again. He walked to the nearest cabinet. He put his hand on the latch. He looked at Theron, who was standing beside the desk with her hands clasped in front of her, waiting. He opened the cabinet. The ledger volumes stood in their places, every spine labeled in Theron's hand, every volume dry and straight and closed. He reached in and took out the volume labeled with the years 1894 to 1896. He opened it to a random page and held it toward the window light. The ink was clear. The entries were legible. The margin notes were precise. He turned to the back of the volume and found the cross-index, 2 pages of columnar entries that mapped every parcel in those years to its grantor, its grantee, and its page number, and from each of those to the related parcel entries in the other volumes. He stood there with the open ledger in his hands for a long moment, his eyes moving across the columns with the left to right steadiness of a man reading a plat. Theron did not speak. There was no point in speaking. The ledger was speaking for itself, and the water line on the wall was speaking, and the wet floor was speaking, and the 32 inches of oak and oilskin that had held all of it dry through a 9-foot flood were speaking more plainly than anything she could have said. Crane closed the ledger. He placed it back in its position in the cabinet. He latched the cabinet door. He looked at Theron. He said, "This is the county's record. Not a question. 4 words, declarative, said the way a surveyor confirms a measurement he has checked twice and found to be correct. The county's record, not Frostbourne's fancy. The county's record, as though the phrase had simply been corrected, the way you correct a number that has been copied wrong." Theron said, "Yes." The words sat in the room between them with the weight that a simple word carries when everything around it has earned it. Crane stayed for 2 hours. He went through every cabinet, opening each one, checking volumes at random, cross-referencing entries against his own field notes from surveys he had filed since April. He found the entries indexed to his plat references, correctly entered, correctly cross-indexed. The grantee references pointing to the grantor columns, the way a properly driven nail points through the board it is holding. He found the margin notes where Theron had corrected the previous recorder's single-entry filings. Each correction explained in a few plain words that told him exactly what the original filing had been and why it had been insufficient. He found every survey reference he had submitted since April entered twice, once under the parcel description and once under his own name in the grantor index. He had not known she had indexed the surveyor's name. He set the volume flat on top of the cabinet and stood for a moment looking at his own name in her handwriting, the entry as spare and accurate as anything in his own field book. He said, "You've indexed by surveyor." It came out quietly, aimed more at himself than at her. Theron said yes. He considered that, returned the volume to its place, and closed the cabinet. He closed the last cabinet and stood in the middle of the record office with his hat still in his hand, looking at the 4 cabinets in their row against the wall, and the water line below them on the east wall, and the floor, and the light coming through the single window. He put his hat on. He said, "I will tell the Territorial Land Office what I found here." Theron said, "I would appreciate that." He went to his horse. He rode south. He stopped once at the corner of the avenue and looked back at the record office, at the closed door with Cato tied beside it, his bulk dark and patient against the pale adobe wall. And then he rode on. Wallace Drum came 2 days later, on the morning of October the 14th. He came alone, without the mill crew, without the Saturday audience. He had been at the land office on the 12th and had seen the deed boxes, and he had heard from 3 separate people what Crane had found at the county record office. He rode up Cimarron Avenue and dismounted at the record office and went inside. The avenue was quiet, the mud drying in stiff ridges where wagon wheels had raked through it, and the air was cold and smelled faintly of pine resin from the direction of the mill. He did not say anything for a long time. He walked to the cabinets the way a man walks toward something he has been wrong about and is not yet certain how to face, his hat already in his hand, though he had only just stepped through the door. He opened one cabinet and looked at the ledgers inside. He ran his thumb slowly across the spine of the nearest volume, a deliberate movement, and then closed the cabinet. He looked at the water line on the east wall, and at the floor, and at the height of the cabinet shelf above the floor, and he did whatever internal arithmetic a man does when the numbers work out in someone else's favor. He did not use the phrase. He did not speak the phrase that he had coined at the mill yard in July and had used across 4 months in front of anyone who would listen. He did not speak it because there was no version of that phrase that was still accurate, and Drum was not a man who said things he knew to be inaccurate. He was wrong, and he had no vocabulary for the thing he was looking at. And so he stood in the record office with his hat in his hand, and then he put his hat back on, and he walked out. He did not apologize. He did not need to. The walking out was enough. The silence was enough. The absence of the phrase was enough. Miriam, who had been sitting in the chair beside the desk mending a shirt, watched him go. She had tracked his path across the room without lifting her head from the mending, and she set the shirt down in her lap when he was through the door. She looked at Theron. Theron was writing in the margin of the 14th ledger volume and didn't look up. Miriam said very quietly, "Well," Theron said, "Yes." The Territorial Land Examiner arrived from Santa Fe on October 22nd. A man named Hollis, sent at Crane's explicit request. He came on the afternoon stage with a leather satchel worn smooth at the handle and a field ledger whose cover had been reinforced along the spine with a strip of canvas tape, the kind of repair that speaks of a document used rather than stored. Hollis spent 3 days in the county record office with his own ledger, open beside Theron's volumes, checking entries against the deeds and plat records that the territorial office held as secondary copies. He worked in methodical silence, laying the territorial copies flat on the desk, running his finger down one column and then the other, turning pages without hurry. On the second afternoon, he asked her with the particular care of a man who wants to get the history right, whether the cross-index had been her own design or drawn from an existing model. She said it was her father's system, adapted from his field book practice. Hollis looked at the 7 cloth-covered field books stacked beside her on the desk. He said, "May I?" She set one open in front of him, turned to the back cover where Harmon Frostbourne's cross-index filled the final pages in his cramped, deliberate hand. Hollis studied it for a long moment without speaking. He found no discrepancies in Theron's volumes. He found in the cross-index a system he had not encountered in any of the other 21 county offices he had inspected during his tenure. He asked Theron to walk him through the method in full, which she did, sitting across the desk from him with an open ledger between them, explaining the 3-path indexing principle as plainly as she had explained anything. She did not call it anything. She explained the principle, which was that any deed in the county should be recoverable in 3 separate ways from any one of those 3 ways, so that the loss of any one pathway still left 2 others intact. She explained the oilskin liners and the cabinet height, which she grounded in the waterline she had observed on the east wall in April. She showed him her father's field books, the 7 cloth-covered volumes stacked on the desk beside her own, and she showed him the cross-index drawn by her father's hand in the back of each one, and she said that she had adapted the principle from surveying practice because it seemed to her that a county deed record and a survey field book were solving the same problem by different names. Hollis wrote for a long time after she stopped talking. Then he wrote some more. He submitted his report to the Territorial Land Office in November. Crane's formal recommendation arrived at roughly the same time, and what Crane called the system in his recommendation was the term that persisted. He called it the Frostbourne method. 2 plain words, a name that described what it was rather than what it had cost, and the Territorial Examiner's report used the same term in its summary section. The first county to formally adopt the Frostbourne method was Union County in the spring of 1900. Mora County followed in the fall of that same year. By 1902, 6 counties in New Mexico Territory had reorganized their deed records according to the system, each one commissioning its own set of raised oak cabinets and oilskin liners, each recorder spending their own version of $17.40 on materials that their predecessors had called an unnecessary expense. The deed boxes, the low pine shelves, the brass hasps that held or didn't hold, the 11-year tradition of keeping county records at floor level because no floor had flooded yet. These things became the past by degrees. Not because anyone made an announcement, but because the October flood had made the announcement for them, and it was not an announcement anyone wanted to have to hear twice. In Cimarron, the record office on Cimarron Avenue continued under Theron's tenure through the end of the territorial period and into the first years after New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912. The 14 ledger volumes she had built between April and October of 1899 remained in active use for the resolution of land title disputes through those years, and when the State Land Office eventually reorganized the county record system under the new statehood protocols, the Colfax County ledgers from 1899 through 1912 were retained in their original form as the primary legal authority for the property descriptions and ownership chains they contained. The Territorial Land Examiner's report noted, in its summary, that the Frostbourne cross-index had allowed the complete reconstruction of Colfax County's pre-flood deed record from the county record office volumes alone, without reference to territorial secondary copies because the three-path indexing had made it possible to verify each entry against two independent access routes within the same set of volumes. This wasn't a small thing. It meant that every landowner in Colfax County whose deed had been in one of the 3 pine boxes on the low shelf of the land office had a clear and legally defensible record of their title. Not because they had been lucky, but because a woman who read water stains on plaster walls and spent $17.40 on oak and oilskin had decided in April of 1899 that the existing system was not sufficient. Crane included a single additional note in his formal recommendation to the territorial office. He wrote that the Frostbourne method represented, in his professional assessment, the most significant improvement to county deed recording practice in the territory in the preceding decade. He wrote it in the same flat, precise language he used for all of his professional documents, which was the highest register of praise available to him and the only one he trusted. He did not reference Frostbourne's fancy. The phrase did not appear in any official document, in any court record, in any territorial bulletin. Drum had coined it at the mill yard in July 1899, and Crane had failed to correct it at the mill yard in August 1899, and by November 1899, neither of them had any occasion to say it again, because the name for the thing had been correctly established. Miriam remained in Cimarron. She took a teaching post at the county school in 1900, which suited her in the way that positions suit people who were made for them, without knowing it until they arrive. She was present when Hollis returned in the spring of 1900 to observe the Union County adoption of the method, and she was present when the Territorial Secretary's office sent a letter of official commendation to the Colfax County Record Office in December of 1899. She read the commendation aloud to Theron at the desk, her voice level, and even in the quiet of the office, the winter light lying pale and flat through the south windows across the desktop. At the end of it, she said nothing for a moment and then said, "Father would have thought this was exactly right." Theron said, "It is exactly right." She did not say it as pride. She said it as fact, which was the same thing her father had taught her, that the correct answer is the correct answer and does not require additional description. The 7 field books that Harmon Frostbourne had kept through 22 years of survey work were on the desk beside Theron's own ledgers throughout her tenure, and they stayed there after, stacked in a small column to the left of the active volume, their cloth covers worn at the corners to a pale buff. They were not official documents. They were not part of the county record. They were simply there, the way a level is present at a building site, not as decoration but as the source of the measurement. A visitor who came to the record office in later years might have noticed the field books and asked about them, and Theron would have said they belonged to her father, who had been a surveyor. She would have said no more than that, because no more than that was necessary. The field books and the 14 ledger volumes and the cross-index that connected them explained themselves to anyone who read them carefully, which was the quality her father had prized above all others in a record, that it should not require its maker to stand beside it and explain. The Cimarron River floods again in some years and does not in others as rivers do. The upper canyon still holds cottonwoods along its banks, and in wet autumns they still lean toward the water with the same patient lean they had in 1899. The land along the Cimarron has changed hands many times across the decades since the flood, and each transfer has had to clear the title back through the chain of ownership, and the chain always runs through the same 14 ledger volumes, because those volumes are where the chain exists. They are still there in the archive, dry and indexed and cross-referenced 3 ways, exactly as she built them. On a morning in late October, after the flood had receded and the avenue had dried, and the last of the season's business had been entered in the final volume, Theron came out of the record office into the pale, clean air that follows heavy weather. and Cato was at the post where she had left him, and the 7 field books were on the desk inside where she had placed them in April, and the 14 ledgers were in their cabinets, dry, and the street was quiet, and the sky above the Sangre de Cristo Mountains was the particular deep blue that comes after rain. She stood at the door for a moment. Then she went back inside,